Welcome to Just Be, the mystical and magical journey into motherhood. This is a place for real conversations. We talk about the things that aren't said out loud enough, the things we may not be prepared for, and all the ways we can feel more connected through it all. It's an invitation to dive into the beauty, the challenges, the intimacy, and the transformation that comes with it. From the practical to the energetic, the messy to the sacred, the human to the mystical, this podcast is a small portal for you to slow down, tune in, and just be. I'm really excited to be here today with Breann. She's one of our Diaper Free Collective EC coaches, and we've been trying to record for a while, and we're finally making it happen here today. And we're going to go into a sensitive topic, so I'll preface this whole episode with the intro. So if you skip past the intro, we are going to be talking about birth loss. So if that's something that's triggering for you right now, maybe skip this episode for the time being. We're going to talk about it because it's something that Breann's experienced, and I think it's something, at least that from my experiences, I was telling her it's not frequent or common, but it does happen. And I think it's something that happens more than what's talked about in our culture and with people in the community. And I think it's something that should be talked about and shared because people feel less alone, either through their experiences with it or even as somebody who's supporting somebody or knows somebody going through that experience. So we're not really sure where the conversation is going to go. We're going to let it flow. But yeah, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more of just you're a mama?
Yes.
You used to be a doula as well. So you can...
Yeah. So again, my name is Breann Snyder. I am a mom of 3 living babies and 1 baby who died. And I came in previously, before I became a mom, I was a birth doula. So I came into parenting through a birth worker lens, which I think adds a little bit of color to my experience. And since then, I have really dove into the parenting world, and I've done a lot of education for other parents and support groups for parents and birth story listening. And now I work primarily with schools and helping other parents in the school community. So that's my elevator pitch background. But yeah, I can start with just a brief synopsis. So I had my first daughter back in 2017, and we knew right away that we wanted to have another child. And so once we got to the approved waiting time that we had decided on, we started trying, and we got pregnant relatively quickly. And I was pregnant with my second right around when my first daughter was around 15 months. So we were expecting her to be, the second baby to be born around the 2-year mark. And it's perfect, right? 2 at 2, that was the goal. And things progressed okay. I guess the other thing I should mention is that my first daughter, she actually was born prematurely. The amniotic sac opened at 35 weeks. And so that's called late term preterm. So she was late term preterm. We transferred to the hospital and had a pretty quick unmedicated birth in the hospital, but she developed a pneumothorax and spent 8 days in the NICU. But otherwise it was totally fine. No infection, no complications, nothing. All that to say, we had this big unknown hovering over our heads of we don't know why it happened. We don't know how it happened. We weren't sure if it would happen again.
Your water just broke?
It just broke.
Okay.
There was nothing. There was no fever on my part. There was no strep infection. It just broke. So there was a lot of unknowns and uncertainty. And there's also not a lot of research for late term preterm. When I faced my second pregnancy, we went into it very nervous and unsure of what was going to happen. We didn't know. We knew that if this was a pattern, it was very likely that I would also go into preterm labor again, and it would happen sooner. That's the only thing that any sort of research indicated. There was also the chance that nothing would happen and it was just a fluke. But again, there's no certainty around
anything.
Yeah.
There's no certainty around anything with birth.
Yeah. Yes. So I had a healthy level of anxiety going into this pregnancy. And I had a little bit of a scare early on in my first to second trimester. I had a bunch of contractions. And my midwife, she said, I called her and I said, I've been having them and they've been going on for about an hour now. And she said, let's go to the hospital. So we went to the hospital for that. And I explained to them, I said, I had not wanted any ultrasounds at this point. I knew that I was anxious and I was worried that having ultrasounds and the uncertainty around ultrasounds would make things worse for me.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you more about that healthy level of anxiety and how you managed that, because I think there's a lot of people, regardless of the history, even first timers, if you're doing IVF or whatever, go into a pregnancy with anxiety, and it's like, how do you manage that?
There's a really simple answer that maybe it'll resonate with some other people, but this is how I was viewing it. I took a lot of birthing from within classes and trainings, and in the book there's this beautiful image of a bunch of ants, and the chapter is called Worry is the Work of Pregnancy, or maybe it's Worry is the Work of Parenting.
Okay.
And it frames the idea that worrying, to an extent, worry is a productive emotion, is a productive motivator, and it's what motivates us to do research. It's what motivates us to find help, to ask for help, to gather resources. And so this image was of these ants working and gathering all their little bits and then taking it back. And so the idea is that, can you have worry, or in this case anxiety, in a way that is protective, in a way that helps you gather resources, be more on the alert for signs and symptoms of something that's gonna happen, in a way that helps me but doesn't stop me, doesn't actually roadblock me from living.
Were there points where you were like, okay, I know this is an indicator that I'm tipping over this productive worry, and then like, how would you balance and bring it back from that?
So this is actually, for me, the biggest thing was my relationship with my midwife, my home birth midwife.
The support.
We talked a lot about this, and she would say to me over and over again, she said, please call me instead of worrying. So she's like, if you ever on the edge or on the ledge, just call me and I'll talk you through it. And she was really sincere about that. So I don't think it's necessarily everybody's home birth midwife experience, but for me, she was more than a midwife. She was definitely my friend.
Yeah.
And that was who I leaned on a lot. And so when I would find myself completely spiraling, I cannot tell you how many times I would spiral about the thought of a UTI, because I know that UTIs can trigger pregnant labor.
Yeah.
I would spiral and just panic completely. I would finally call my midwife and she'd be like, what are your symptoms? And I'd be like, I don't have any symptoms. I'm just worried about it. She'd be like, oh, okay, here's where we're at right now. And then she would talk me down. So that was when things were getting too bad, I could call my person.
Yeah. Kind of like you're the sponsor.
Yes, it very much was like call a friend sort of situation. So anyways, worry is the work of pregnancy. And I think the other advice was that, can the ants do the work while you're sleeping? So could you gather your thoughts and your worries and write them down, or share them with somebody and then rest and let your brain, your subconscious do some of that
processing.
Work. That processing for you. That's how I viewed a healthy amount of worry, anxiety. So as I said in this story, I was somewhere in the second trimester that I had a bunch of contractions. We went to the hospital. I asked not to have a full ultrasound. They did want to just make sure, and my water had not broken, and by then the contractions had stopped, but they just wanted to check the heartbeat of the baby. And so they checked that, and everything was fine, and they let me go, and great. I went back to my normal amount of worrying. But then I hit 28 weeks, and I was actually on a vacation with my family up in Oregon, and I was going to leave the next day, and I remember thinking, did I just pee myself? And sometimes our brains are just so powerful that my brain was like, yes, you just peed yourself. Don't say anything. Just go to the bathroom, get a pad, and you'll be fine. You just have to get home. And my brain would not let me think beyond the just put a pad in and it's going to be fine. I had my daughter with me. I had to get on an airplane the next day. I was like, I just needed to get home. And again, it was a leak of water. It was a trickle. It was not like a full gush. There was no blood. This was my brain doing a relatively healthy decision to protect me from reality.
Yeah.
So I managed to get home.
And that's a very probable thing to happen at that point in a pregnancy, I think.
Yeah, like, again, it could have been a UTI. I was very rational about the possibility of UTIs happening, even though they actually didn't. So anyways, I made it home before I finally called my midwife, and I said, I think my water was open. And she said, okay. And I had a good cry. I sat with my daughter. We took a nap after our flight, and then I told my husband, and we had a good cry on the couch, and I knew, okay, here we go. And my midwife told me, she came to get me, and she said, you need to pack a bag because the earlier your water breaks, the more likely it is going to be a long haul in hospital. She prepared me a little bit.
You were at 28 weeks.
28 weeks, okay. Yeah. And that was also a tough mental conversation I was having with myself, and a very frank conversation I was having with my husband, because in California, in a lot of the hospitals that we have in our area, viability is around 24 weeks. Most of the country, it's closer to 26 weeks. So 28 weeks is like, you're just on the other side of everything could be fine or everything could be terrible. Yeah. So that was a very frank conversation that we were having too. What kind of interventions did we want to have if labor proceeded? Because at this point it was just a small trickle of water, and that, who knows what that means. But anyways, we had a conversation, and we had a lot of strong feelings of like what we felt capable of parenting through and what we didn't feel capable parenting through. So that was on our minds. And then we went to the hospital, and they checked me in. It was very sweet, but also very frustrating. The hospital tried everything in their power to convince me and themselves that it was not my amniotic fluid.
Oh, wow.
And they were like, I don't think so. It could just be pee. Are you sure? Really? And it wasn't until they took a sample and looked at it under the slides, and they're like, oh, yeah, it's definitely your amniotic fluid. I appreciate that they weren't just going to admit me for, I think I'm peeing myself. But it also was like, me and my midwife were like, we've been through this before. Yeah. We know what this is. So they checked me in at 28 weeks, and then we sat and waited. That is in its own podcast in and of itself, is when you're in the hospital and healthy, but you can't leave.
Yeah. And you're on bed rest. It was just a leak, and they didn't really know.
Yeah. Again, we didn't know. I didn't have any infection. Surprisingly, we had already done the Group B strep test for my home birth. So we got the results the next day, and they were negative. And so again, I didn't have Group B strep. I wasn't showing any sign of infection myself. The water was clear. The heartbeat was strong. So there was, again, no real reason that was explaining all this. So now here's where my story starts to take a bit of a fork in the road. Everything appeared fine and healthy. And also, I was in the hospital, but I had wanted a home birth. And I had gone into the home birth selection because I assume everything is fine. Everything is healthy with me and my family. And I was expecting a healthy pregnancy as well. So I have a lot of...
And for your first, you had wanted to do a home birth as well. And that was when you were rushed to the hospital when the water broke.
Yes. Okay. And again, even in there, it was like, did the hospital cause the pneumothorax? There's some research that says that hospital interventions with the CPAP masks can trigger a pneumothorax. So again, there's just a lot of, is the hospital right for me in this situation? And I will always, no matter why I'm in the hospital, I will always come with that framework, that lens. And so I was questioning a lot. From everything, they'd be like, here, do you want to take this prenatal vitamin? I'd be like, no, actually, I don't want a prenatal vitamin. They don't work for me. And they'd be like, but it's a prenatal vitamin. I say, I don't want a prenatal vitamin. And here's your hospital food. And I say, no, I don't want my hospital food. My family and friends are bringing me home cooked meals. And like, but it's free. I'm like, I understand it's free. I still don't want it. So for me, the hospital was like a battle every single day of me trying to maintain my lifestyle and my health therefore my baby's health, in these ways that the hospital didn't support.
Yeah.
And so it was constantly, every nurse that came in, every doctor that came in, I was in a teaching hospital, so it was a whole bunch of doctors that would come in every morning.
Yeah.
And they would always be like, why aren't you taking the prenatal vitamin? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And I'd have to explain again and again.
I feel like that's like a whole podcast episode in itself, as the hospital versus our choices, sovereign choices.
Yeah.
And actually how much, that is, it energetically takes to, and it really can make a difference, especially when someone comes in and is telling you you're doing something wrong over and over again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And eventually, at some point, one of the nurses, or maybe it was one of the doctors, she came and she sat on my bed and was talking with me about all of my choices and my reasoning and all that stuff. And she goes, you sound like you really know what you're talking about. You've done your research. You trust your body. You make a lot of sense. Do you want me to just write a note to put in your chart, and then you can sign it and I'll sign it? And that way everybody who comes to do rounds with you will read the note first, and then they won't come in and ask you these questions anymore. And I was like, yes, thank you so much.
Like, why didn't we do this from the start?
Yes. Yeah. So I think it took maybe a week or two before that option was given to me. But yes, it was a very surreal experience. And again, because there was nothing wrong with me this whole time. I was just in the hospital because I kept leaking amniotic fluid.
And nobody knew why.
And nobody knew why.
And it was for the safety of the in case something
just in case I went into preterm labor, right? Like, you want to be as close to the hospital as possible to have it when a tiny baby slips out. So, it was a very strange mind. And I had a toddler at home. And that was really the tragedy of the whole experience, was the toddler at home. Yeah. She would come and visit me, but at some point it almost became worse when she would visit me, because then she'd have to say goodbye. And it was just devastating. And I was still nursing her at this time. And so she would come in and she would just immediately start nursing. And then that would trigger contractions and I'd start panicking. And then she would want to fall asleep and she'd be wanting to nap in the hospital bed with me. But there was only so much time we would have. That was probably the hardest part, was having her come. But she did get to come. Like, that was also really special. And I want to acknowledge, especially since then, since COVID has happened, and I've heard all those experiences of babies and parents not being able to come and visit in the hospital, it really changes the way I look back on that memory. Yeah. It was difficult to have her come and see me every day. So that was me in the hospital. The other thing that is important to know is everything that we could measure was still fine. So again, I was checking my temperature every day. We were doing monitoring in the morning and the afternoon of contractions and of baby's heartbeat, and those were fine. And I was growing. I hide my pregnancies very well in my body. I have a deep pelvis, so I never appear very pregnant. So the doctors kept being like, you do not look like you're 30 weeks pregnant. You do not look like you're 29 weeks pregnant. But I would lie down and we'd get the measuring tape out and we'd measure and be like, no, I am measuring. I have gained a centimeter since last week. I am growing. I know it doesn't look, when I stand up, it just drops down and disappears. But to everybody's metrics, the baby was still growing. I was still gaining weight. Baby was still kicking a lot, doing all sorts of somersaults. There was all these signs of reassurance. So there's that. Then the other thing to know is the way that I approach medical decisions is, if I figure out XYZ now, what treatment options would be presented to me based on that information? So there's worst case scenario is that baby's going to come out and be born and we're going to need an intervention. I understood that. Okay. I was looking for contractions. I was looking for bleeding. I was looking for a mucus plug. Those are my signs that labor was going to start. Aside from that, there was this other, why did this happen? Do we have an infection? Yeah. We were monitoring my temperature. We were monitoring blood samples and urine samples. There was no sign of infection. So that was probably not going to happen. Is there something wrong with the baby? How do we know there's something wrong with the baby? Is the baby growing? Is the baby's heartbeat going? Are there movements? Those were all happening as well. Should we do an ultrasound? What does an ultrasound tell us? Yeah. And the reality for me is that ultrasounds are not actually black and white. They're not hard, fast truths. And they can tell a lot of uncertainty. And with that uncertainty comes anxiety. So I asked a lot. I was said, if we do an ultrasound today, what will that tell us that would change anything else?
Yeah.
Knowing what we already know about everything else, my body and the baby's movements, what would an ultrasound change for me? And the only thing that the doctors were agreeing on is based on the healthy movements and the growth, the only thing they would tell us is if the baby does have intrauterine growth restriction.
Yeah.
Which I was like, but baby's growing. I don't think that's the case. Yeah. But they said there's still a possibility, and they measure that based on the head versus the body size. If that's the case, their recommendation would be for me to stay pregnant until
37.
Until 32 weeks.
32, okay.
In which case they might recommend starting labor or doing a cesarean. So I said, okay, I'm 28 weeks. Let's wait. Until 32 weeks. If nothing's going to change, like if your prognosis would still be for me to stay pregnant, I want to stay pregnant in positivity.
Totally.
I want to stay pregnant in optimism before anything changes. I do not want to spend the next 4 weeks panicking that my baby is too small and I'm hurting the baby by staying pregnant, because you're telling me that staying pregnant is actually the best thing.
I had IUGR all the way up till birth, but they had said 37 weeks, and even then I pushed past it, and I was like getting the whole you're killing your baby every day, you don't induce. And honestly, IUGR doesn't, your baby's small, but it doesn't really indicate if, like you said, if the heartbeat's strong, if the baby's moving, it doesn't, so you have a small baby. It doesn't really indicate anything else.
I'm telling my story right now. This is not your story or someone else's story. Everybody goes through their own difference with their own story, their own baggage, their own lens. But in my experience, in my lens,
there was no other indicators.
There was no other indicators, and I just wanted to be as healthy as possible. And I knew that meant I had to believe everything was okay. So that I could eat and stay positive and sleep. If I let myself give into the anxiety, I would totally spiral, and it would be really bad for me and the baby. So I made the choice to not have any ultrasounds this whole time. And there definitely was some pushback, but again, everything else was pointing to you're fine. Baby's moving, you are growing, the water was clear.
What would the difference have been if they had done an ultrasound? Would they have induced earlier, or?
So again, they were saying maybe at 32 weeks.
Okay.
That was the earliest they would consider inducing if it was IUGR. So that was the benchmark that I had put in my head, as I was like, okay, I'm going to give myself, if I stay pregnant for 4 more weeks, that's amazing. If I don't, we'll deal with it when we get there. And they're like, we need to figure out if baby's head down or head up. I was like, don't babies flip-flop a lot at this time? Just because I have an ultrasound tomorrow, I go into labor next week, you're going to do another ultrasound because the baby was moving in between that. So an ultrasound did not make sense to me in a way that would change anything. That was how I made that decision. And time crept by. I did so many puzzles. I was a puzzle queen. I watched the entire series of Game of Thrones. I had never done it, and my midwife was like, "Oh, this is going to be great. We'll start at the beginning." And I made
it's a tough one to watch when you have anxiety.
It's intense, but I think I paired it with the puzzling, and that helped. I do pretty well with fantasy.
Okay,
that was definitely the extreme. I don't know if I would recommend Game of Thrones again, but
keeps you engaged.
It was enough to take me out of the situation and take me somewhere else for a period of time. Plus, I have 4 weeks to do this. So anyways, that's what I did. I was a doula, so I told all the doulas that I was there. I was like, if you're ever in the hospital for supporting a birth, come on over and say hi. I'd love to see you. My midwife is still coming to visit. Lots of visitors, lots of things to keep me sane as best as I could. And then I made it to 32 weeks, and everything happened pretty quickly at this point. My friend came to visit me. She brought me breakfast, one of my favorites, and I gave her a hug, and she said goodbye, and I checked my email, and my family had sent me an email saying, thinking of you, how's today? And I sent my regular daily email. We made it to 32 weeks. This is a big day because according to medical science, this is the day that the brain development the critical parts are done. A baby being born at 32 weeks has a relatively intact brain functions. And then There's still a lot of hurdles, but most likely they're going to be just fine. So it was like 32 weeks was huge. We made it. I pressed send and I turned to walk back to my bed, and that's when my water completely released. So at this point, it had just been a trickle that a pad was able to absorb. But at this moment, it balloon popped all over the floor. I was standing in a puddle.
Okay.
And so I just had that clarity of, okay,
It's happening.
the labor train is leaving the station.
Yeah.
So I called my midwife immediately. She was my first call. And I said, I need you to come to the hospital. My water opened. And she had that moment of being like, but your water's been open? I said, no, it's all the way open.
The floodgates.
The full water. There's no more water in me open. And she's like, okay, I'm on my way. And I called my husband. He also had just gotten home from his visit. And we had a friend in town. And so he said, do I bring Kingsley? I said, no, leave my daughter home with a friend. He jumped on his motorcycle and zoomed to the hospital so he could get there as quickly as possible. And then I called the nurse. I buzzed the station. I was like, my water's open. And they're like, your water's been open?
Yeah,
What? Again, what are you talking about? And I was like, I need the doctor now.
Yeah.
So everybody converged in the room. My doctor was Dr. Melissa Rosenstein, and she was amazing. And I want to give her a lot of credit for how this experience unfolded. Everybody arrived and looked at me with that just, you're so cute, Breann. Everything is fine. We're here for you, but also overreacting. And I was like, no, this is different. This is my body saying it's different. Let's do the ultrasound. And they're like, are you sure? I was like, yes, I'm sure. I trust what's happening, and I trust that my baby's going to be born, if not now, within a day. This is real. And so they said, okay, we're going to trust you. And I really appreciate the hospital does not always trust you, but they trusted me. And they said, okay, we will do the ultrasound. So I called, we had my midwife, we had the secondary midwife came, my photographer came, all of my 2 doulas, they showed up. Everyone's arriving, okay? By the time they get the ultrasound in, it's 4 p.m, and it's one of the bedside ultrasounds. And the reason we were doing the ultrasound was to figure out the position of the baby. Because if the baby was breech, which according to my midwife's palpitations, the head was up, so it was most likely breech, then I would probably have to have a cesarean, because it's very dangerous for a preemie's head, a very soft, delicate head, to go through the breech birth, vaginal birth. So I was like, I want to know cesarean or not cesarean. Like, that was my mantra. That's all I was focusing on. Melissa, she hooks it up and she's looking, she's doing the ultrasound, and this is like just in the movies, she just gets really quiet and everything kind of goes still. And I turn and I look at the ultrasound, and I had never really had ultrasounds. I don't have a lot of experience with ultrasounds, but I just remember looking at the ultrasound for just a second and just thinking to myself, that doesn't look right. And there was just this pause, and I just said to her, what's wrong? And she said, a lot. And she said, but I don't know for sure, so I need to do some more work. And so she wraps everything up, and she turns to me and she says, baby's breech. And I was like, okay, let's prepare for a cesarean. I was getting in my prep mode. We're ready. Let's prep Aaron. Let's get ready for this surgical birth. And she said, I need to go make some phone calls, and I think we need to have a full ultrasound, because the bedside ultrasound machine is a Polaroid. Mm-hmm. And she wanted to have the full ultrasound machine, which is much more like it's much more in-depth imaging. And they needed to call radiology for that to happen. And it was now 5:00, which in the hospital world means that the day shift is leaving and doing the turnover for the night shift. So everything was on the hospital time, which meant that we sat and waited for a little bit. And in the meantime, I prepped my husband for what I needed in the OR, who I was going to have in with me, what my options were in terms of my birth plan. I could have the lights down. Did I want music playing? All those things, just trying to get ready for it. Then the radiologist came in, and she was very kind. I really also appreciate her so much. I explained, I said, I don't know what's going on. I don't want to hear the heartbeat. Please don't have the audio on for me. I knew that was a trigger for myself. Just please do this as quickly as possible. And she was so kind, and she did exactly that. She was very fast. She took the measurements, the pictures that she needed, and then she left. That felt like a very seen moment for me, which I want to just thank the universe for. Just every little interaction you have that fills you, that calms you down was worthwhile. So that was that for me. And now it's around 7 p.m. It's getting later. And Melissa comes back in and she sits down and she just says, I've called, I have some calls out, I've sent the photos to some of my colleagues. I don't know exactly what I'm looking at, but I do know that it's incompatible with life. And I was like, oh, okay. Our brains are just so beautiful the way that they protect us. It immediately was just business mode. We will deal with the grief of this later. First question, will my baby suffer? And at this point, I was still feeling some movements. And she said, I don't know. It's possible if you're concerned about that, we can provide pain relief for your baby. I was like, great, let's do that. And then the next question I had was, does this mean I can have a vaginal birth? And she said, sure, if that's what you prefer, we could do a vaginal birth. And I said, okay, great, let's go ahead and have this baby. Or actually, the third question was, who is the midwife in charge at the hospital? And she told me who it was. And I said, no, thank you. I do not want her in my room with me. And this is the perk of being a doula. Yeah. I knew who this midwife was.
Yeah.
And she was very skilled, but she was not the energy that I wanted. So I got to make that statement. And Melissa, to her credit, said, okay. And then I said, all right, let's go have this baby. And everyone was, do you need a minute? I think they were in their own process of grief. And again, I was just like, we need to get this train going. We know this. We know the answer now. And I just need to keep one foot from the other. And again, I think like this is what my midwife and I have reflected a lot on is like there's this body knowing that our brain cannot catch up with. Yeah. And so I think my body really knew what was going on and was doing everything it could to protect me, because the very next thing that happened is I stood up and started bleeding. And I think Melissa and my midwife were both, you're not really having contractions, so are you sure that like you're in labor? This seems like early. And I was like, no, this is happening. Get me in labor and delivery. I'm going to have this baby. And they're like, are you sure? And then I stood up, and that's when the blood started pouring out of me. And I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is happening. Let's do this. And they're like, okay. So we hustled to labor and delivery, which is just down a hallway. And I ran. I was like, do you wheel? Like, how do I get there? And they're like, you could just walk. And I was like, great, we're just going to walk. Can you please make sure there's no pregnant person in the hallway? I don't want to see them. And again, I'd been there for 4 weeks. I had seen my neighbors, right? I had known who was around me, and I didn't want to make eye contact with any of them. Thankfully, it was nighttime. Like, odds were low, and they're like, this isn't usually something we do, but the fact that you had to ask for this, maybe we can make it happen. And it was one of those things where, like, there was me in antepartum, there's a hallway, and then there's labor and delivery. And they basically put me in the first available labor and delivery room, so I didn't have to cross the entire ward. And I just booked it, holding the Chuck's pad in between my legs, and just ran down the hallway into the labor and delivery room. And my doulas packed up my whole hospital room that I'd been living in. They packed everything up, and we all moved into the labor and delivery room. And we had a beautiful birth experience there. For like the quick overview, I found out like the ultrasound and all the conversation happened around like 8 p.m. And then Flossie, that's the name we gave her, she was born around 11:30 p.m. So it did happen pretty quickly. From finding out to actually delivering her.
And this is like without induction or anything.
Yeah, this was like my body really just took over. And I think once I started bleeding, I knew in the back of my head, I was like...
And you didn't start bleeding until they told you the situation.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Everything was told. It was just clear amniotic fluid.
Yeah.
And then it was like, I got up to use the bathroom or to check. And that's when it was like, that's a lot of blood.
Yeah.
And my midwife, my home birth midwife, she remained calm with all the blood. And so I was using her as my anchor. I was like, if she's not freaking out, I'm not going to freak out. And again, I knew that like part of pregnancy, the work of pregnancy is actually to increase the amount of blood in your body. So I knew, I said, I have extra blood to bleed.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of having that extra blood is if something goes wrong, you have a window. So I was like, as long as my midwife is calm and confident that I'm in that window, I'm not going to panic. I'm going to trust the process. Also, I'm not going to slow it down. So I was doing everything I could to birth the baby as quickly as possible. I was like squatting into all the contractions. I was like pushing with them, trying to make them like visualizing that cervix opening every single time. I was like, the more pain, the better, because I knew it meant I was progressing.
Yeah.
And I did not want this to be a hospital experience. I didn't want to have interventions. I didn't want to have medication or surgery. Like, I wanted this to be my own body experience. And for whatever reason, I got to have that. So the labor progressed pretty quickly. My midwife and the doctors were weighing all the Chuck's pads. Every time they would fill, they would weigh them. So they were tracking how much blood I was losing. But for the most part, they left me alone with my team, with my own team. So I had my 2 doulas. I had my primary midwife and her assistant, plus a second midwife. So there were 3 midwives, at least one in training, in the room. And I had my photographer and my husband. So we had a full house in the room. And every so often, a nurse would come in and check. And Melissa, she called and told her family that she was going to stay. So she actually stayed with me to help me through this process, because I told her that I didn't want the on-call midwife with me. So that was another, I was seen, and that was a beautiful gift that was given to me to have that experience. Based on what they didn't know from the ultrasound, no one was really sure if the baby would be born alive or not. They didn't know for certain. So there was the option that the baby would be born, in which case I had asked for pain medication, no interventions, no life-saving measures, but some pain medication, which is something they can give preemies in this case, like a little shot or inhalation of morphine. So we had the NICU team was like on standby in the hallway essentially. And I remember when I started pushing her out, her hand came out first. The way that she was warmed, her hand fell out. And I reached down and I grabbed her hand. And my midwife must have seen that. And so she turned around and she said, the baby's dead. And so they told the doctor and they told the NICU team. And so everyone left at that point. And I was allowed to then birth the rest of her out without any real questioning or intervention. Nobody came and took the baby away from me. We all knew what to expect at that point. So then, yeah, she was born on the hospital floor because that's where I ended up. And we caught her and we held her. And then at this point, I was still a little bleeding. And Melissa was like, can we take care of you? And I just looked at her and I said, I'm going to stop now.
Yeah.
And she was like, what? And my midwife looked at me and she looked at Melissa and we all looked down and they're like, oh, I think she might be right, actually. And again, this is all surreal. There was no logical brain.
You're still birthing. I mean, you're still in labor.
There was no logical brain operating. This was all this intuitive, like maternal power taking control.
Yeah.
And I knew that I would, and I did. So in hindsight, what we know now is that Flossie and her placenta were basically attached. And so once the amniotic fluid left and I started having labor, she started moving to be born. She was pulling the placenta off, which is why I was bleeding. And so as soon as she was born and the placenta at the same time, my uterus was like, oh, we're done. And it clamps down pretty quickly. And so I did actually stop bleeding at that point. Yeah. I don't know how much blood I actually lost during that process. Like I said, it was a very fast labor.
Yeah.
So I maintained strength through the entire process. Yeah. And then she was born at 11:30. And Melissa left us and we were all in the room together for probably an hour. The nurse would come in and just check to see if I was still bleeding. And we had our photographer there, and we were taking photos together as a family. We were all just, I was making some really dark jokes because that's what I do.
Processing.
Yes. Yeah, I think we sang a song together. I don't really have a clear memory of too much in that space.
Yeah.
And then at some point, they were like, we can move you. And I was like, you better not move me to postpartum.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to postpartum.
Hear babies crying and everything.
And so they said, we'll just move you back to the room.
That's actually a really interesting point, because is that what they normally do in a hospital?
So the actual plan is they put you in antepartum.
Okay.
They put you,
because I was like, that can't be. I'm like, I had a feeling like it wasn't that because of that reason. I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the policy is to go to antepartum. It was just like slightly ironic that they put me right back in the same room that my doulas had frantically just cleared all my stuff. And they put me right back in there all over again. And I was just like, I'm never going to leave this room. I had been there for a month at that point. Yeah. So anyways, we went back to that room. And then this is where things actually started to settle for me. I think at this point I had been a little afraid of Flossie, like afraid to see her, afraid to acknowledge what had happened. So she was just wrapped up in a blanket, and that was how I had her. But then when we got there,
So they let you keep her for how long?
until the next day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Is that pretty standard if everything is?
Not necessarily. Also, a fun fact is that my midwife is very close friends with the woman in charge of things like this.
It helps. It helps to have these
So together, the two of them have created a beautiful protocol for stillbirths, for neonatal death.
Yeah.
So that the hospital, the policy is to keep the baby as long as possible. Normal hospital policy is it is throughway to the funeral home, right? They check the paperwork and the funeral home comes and gets them immediately. But because you're pregnant, you're recovering from birth, you can't actually leave the hospital.
Anyway, yeah.
They actually know now to keep the baby in the hospital as long as possible, as long as there's space, as long as they can, and to let the families visit the baby or bring the baby back as often as they want within that time. So in my case, I left the next day, like the next afternoon, midday, and Flossie stayed with me the whole time. Okay. There are instances where the babies have been taken to the hospital morgue, but then brought back to the room when the parents, or like when family comes and they want to meet the baby. That has been made available. So that's a beautiful treasure that I know not everybody has access to.
Yeah.
So when we went back to the room and I had Flossie with me, I finally was like, okay, I need to be with this. And Flossie was really the first death I had experienced. I didn't have anybody else really close to me, die in a meaningful way.
Had you known other people who've had stillbirths at that point, or even, I know stillbirth is a very different experience from a pregnancy loss in the earlier term, but had you known anybody who...
It's so funny. When I went into my first pregnancy, I chose home birth, and first pregnancy, there's a lot of unknowns. You don't know how your body's going to handle pregnancy. You don't know how your genetics is going to make a baby, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. So there's this like looming threat that things could go wrong and that the unexpected could happen. And so dealing with that concept of a home birth, I sat with that question a lot of, do I still want a home birth if my baby dies? Is that still the choice that I want to make? And I ultimately came to the decision that yes, the home birth option still felt safe and right to me, even if the end of the story was my baby died for whatever reason. Like that was just the imaginary logical train of thought that I went down, and I still felt safe and confident with the home birth decision. That being said, I only wanted to hear about successful home births in that pregnancy period. So I only wanted to listen to podcasts where it was like a first-time home birth that stayed at home, or that were these successful first-time births at home, because I knew there was like a risk of transfer, but I wanted to fill my cup with optimism.
I feel like that's pretty normal, to be honest. And I know there's maybe some people who logic oh, it's good to prepare yourself for these situations, but I almost think it's better to be like, yeah, like you said, you're very sensitive to information,
Yes.
and it's very important in that time to only allow in what's going to make you feel
Yes.
good. Especially even so you came in there, if you're a worrier, right?
Yes.
Like you have the anxiety, it's like, why are we adding to that with the knowing that birth is birth? You can know that, and we'll cross that road when we get to it, kind of thing.
Yes. And so my midwife is fantastic, and we always had evidence-based conversations for every decision, for every intervention.
Yeah.
I was reading the literature, I was talking through the options with my husband, and then we were coming to a decision.
Yeah.
But also, I only wanted positive anecdotes.
Yes.
I did not. I didn't
There's
want,
nothing wrong with that, I don't think. I think that's a very normal thing in that time. I know a lot of people who are like that, and the people are like, well, are you avoiding reality? And there's a million outcomes to reality. Do we need to go through them all right now?
Like, I only want to pursue the reality that is most likely to happen.
Yeah.
And that was the like evidence that I was following.
Yeah.
So when Flossie came, that was my first real experience with that.
Yeah.
And as a birth doula, I worked with families who had miscarriages prior to hiring me. So it wasn't that I was completely naive to what birth trauma looks like or birth grief.
Yeah,
but
stillbirth is different.
Yeah, but this was entirely new and entirely unavoidable. This was in my face, and I needed to do something. And I honestly, the thing that came to my mind when I was like, what do I do? How do I handle this dead body in front of me? Like that experience physically and emotionally. The thing that came to me was elephant moms. And I was just like, the elephant moms will go over and touch the body with their trunk and do a full examination of the body. And they will sit with the body. And I was like, okay, we're just going to follow the animal kingdom's lead. And so I just unwrapped her and I started examining her body and just seeing her, like seeing this baby that I had birthed. And there was this part where I was like, she looks really dirty. I don't like this. And my midwife was like, you could give her a bath. And I was like, yes, that's what we need right now. So we took her, and then in hospitals, they give you that plastic bin. And I was like, I don't want her to touch plastic. All those things. So we took her into the bathroom sink, and I laid a blanket in the sink so it clogged the drain. And we filled the sink that way with water. And I gave her this little bath, this little scrub down. And then we got a fresh blanket. We brought her back and we dried her off. And and then we sat with her some more. This is the reality of being a toddler mom while raising a baby. Is I was like, what's my other kid doing? Where is she? Who has her? And my midwife was like, I'm going to go home and sleep. I'm going to come back tomorrow morning, but your husband can stay with you. And I was like, no, he cannot. He has to go be with my child. And my midwife was like, but you're the one in physical pain, right? Like, you need him more. And I was like, no, actually, I don't. I want him to. The pain of me worrying about my living daughter was worse than me sleeping alone. And my doula, beautiful soul, was like, I will stay with you. And so we made the decision for my husband to go home to sleep with our toddler and for my doula to stay with me. And we curled up. I put Flossie next to me in the bed. My doula slept on the couch, the pull-out couch. I put on a podcast because I definitely could not be alone with my thoughts at that point. And we fell asleep. And then the next day came. And there were some rituals and traditions that hospitals traditionally provide families with stillbirth. They have a little box of keepsakes and mementos and things. And my husband brought my toddler to the hospital. And we're in a hospital that's attached to a children's hospital. So they actually have a lot of support for children. And whoever was in charge expressed what was going on to the children's hospital. So a social worker came and she brought a bag of books and a bag of literature. And she was there when my daughter came in, and she was like there for us to help fumble through what we were saying. She was like 18 months. No, she was 20 months at this point. She was almost 2 when this happened. So she was verbal, but again, she's not quite 2. Like, how does that happen? So there was a little bit of like awkwardness, but we fumbled through it together. And then she said, today happens to be the musical therapy day for the Children's Hospital. So we have somebody here who's playing music for the children. Would you like us to bring him over? And she was pointing to this research that says that who knows what a 2-year-old remembers, but one thing they do know is that when you can get more than one sense involved, the memory tends to stick. And that, I think, was our concern, is like, will she even remember her sister?
Yeah.
How can she process this when she's so little? And so the idea was that if you bring music in addition to the touching and the talking, you'll have another layer to imprint the memory.
Yeah.
So we brought the musician. She came, and she just had her guitar, and I think she sang a song of her own. I don't actually remember, but the only song that my toddler knew that the musician knew was Twinkle Little Star. So she played that, and we all sang it together.
Yeah. Wow.
And I actually don't really know if my daughter remembers that particular experience, but that's how we did it. And then we took some footprints, we took some more photos together, and then we wrapped her up in a blanket and we said goodbye, and we all left as a family.
Yeah.
And went home at that point. And there's like a whole other podcast worth of what happened next.
You made it to the end. Thank you for tuning into this episode. I hope it resonated with you in some small way. You can find more links to any of the mentioned resources, as well as some other offerings and fun goodies that I have in the show notes. And if you want to support or share your love for the podcast, you know what to do. Share an episode with someone you know, subscribe, leave a review, or just reach out and say hello. I truly do love connecting with everyone that listens to the podcast. You can find the email and voicemail links for that in the show notes as well. I'll be back with another episode soon, but until next time, just remember, you don't have to have it all figured out. You're allowed to just be.